The silence of the early morning was broken by the shrill ring of a 911 call. My wife! She's not breathing. I think she's killed herself. The voice on the line was tense but not frantic. The caller identified himself as Gregory Brent Dennis, a well-respected psychologist living in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Henderson, Nevada. He reported that his wife, Susan Winters, had overdosed, that she had been struggling with depression, and that he had just discovered her motionless in their bedroom. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, flashing lights illuminating the otherwise peaceful street. The house, a two-story suburban home, looked no different from the others, neatly maintained, secure, and quiet. But inside, something was terribly wrong. Susan Winters lay still on her bed, her body cold to the touch. The room was in perfect order, no signs of a struggle or disturbance. On the nightstand beside her, paramedics found an open bottle of oxycodone, a partially consumed glass of water, and an unmarked plastic container filled with a clear liquid. A quick assessment confirmed the worst. Susan was gone. The initial speculation? Suicide. A combination of oxycodone and what would later be identified as ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze. Gregory stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, his face marked with grief. Or was it something else? He explained to the officers that his wife had been suffering from severe depression, that she had spoken of ending her life before, and that he had tried to help her. But in the end, it had been too much. The responding officers took notes, but something felt off. There was no suicide note. There were no signs of distress. There was no smell of vomit or bodily fluids, something expected if a person had ingested antifreeze, which caused severe internal burning before death. One of the detectives glanced around the room. Something wasn't right. Gregory's statement was strangely rehearsed. He was upset, certainly, but his voice lacked the shaky, broken cadence of a man who had just lost his wife in such a traumatic way. And then there was the timeline. He claimed he had gone to bed early, had slept through the night, and only discovered Susan's unresponsive body in the morning. But why hadn't he checked on her earlier? Why hadn't he noticed anything wrong? And why did his grief seem so restrained? The detective didn't have answers yet, but his gut told him one thing. This wasn't an open and shut suicide case. As the forensic team arrived to begin their assessment, another officer accessed Susan's computer. If she had truly planned her own death, there would likely be traces, search histories, digital notes, something. And sure enough, the search history revealed terms related to suicide by antifreeze poisoning. It seemed to support Gregory's story, but what no one yet realized was that this evidence would soon become the most damning clue in the case. Because in just a few weeks, investigators would discover something chilling. The search had not been made by Susan at all. This wasn't a suicide. It was something far worse. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Susan Winters was found dead in the bedroom of her suburban home in Henderson, Nevada. What appeared at first glance as a tragic suicide had slowly transformed into a troubling puzzle, filled with contradictions that refused to go away quietly. Detective Mark Thompson, a seasoned investigator known among colleagues for his meticulous attention to detail, was assigned to take another look into the circumstances surrounding Susan's death. He had spent a lifetime navigating the murky waters of homicide investigations, yet something about this case unsettled him more than usual. The tidy house, the stable careers, the idyllic facade, none of it aligned neatly with the grim reality awaiting behind closed doors. The case file rested on Detective Thompson's desk, thick with initial forensic reports, officer notes, and photographs from the scene. He flipped through images, pausing at the snapshot of Susan Winters, lying lifeless on her own bed. She appeared peaceful, almost serene, yet her death screamed chaos and desperation. The first red flag emerged from the toxicology report. Ethylene glycol, the primary ingredient found in antifreeze, was confirmed in Susan's bloodstream at alarmingly high levels. But there was something troubling about the combination with oxycodone. Suicide by poisoning usually involved clear signs of physical distress, violent illness, spilled fluids, chaos at the scene. But this room had none of that. It was suspiciously tidy, almost staged. Detective Thompson shifted uneasily in his chair as he reread Gregory Brent Dennis's original statement to responding officers. Dennis described finding Susan unconscious early in the morning after a full night's sleep, yet GPS data from Dennis's phone, recently obtained by subpoena, painted a different picture. His phone had been active throughout the night, showing movement in and out of the house at odd hours, contradicting his earlier statements. The detective's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Claire Winters, Susan's mother. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was steel behind her words. "Detective, Susan didn't do this. I know my daughter. She wouldn't just leave us like this. She was planning a vacation, excited for the future. You must look deeper." Thompson reassured her, promising to look into every detail carefully. But privately he wondered, could a mother's intuition be clouded by grief, or was her instinct revealing something more sinister? Over the next several days, Detective Thompson painstakingly reviewed Susan's digital history. At first glance, the search terms on her computer, suicide by antifreeze, how to overdose on medication, appeared conclusive. But a deeper forensic examination revealed something disturbing. All searches were conducted within a narrow time frame, strangely coinciding with moments when Gregory Dennis was alone at home. Further, they had been methodically deleted from the search history, as if someone had desperately attempted to erase digital footprints after creating them. Thompson's stomach tightened with realization. Someone had deliberately staged these searches. Someone who knew Susan's passwords, her routines, someone who had unrestricted access to her private spaces. Someone close. As suspicion deepened, Thompson began quietly interviewing those in Gregory Dennis's circle. Friends described him as charismatic, intelligent, but increasingly withdrawn and secretive in recent months. Patients of his psychology practice whispered about appointments frequently canceled last minute, moments of distraction and unusual irritability. Worse yet, some mentioned Dennis's struggles with prescription medications, oxycodone specifically. One evening, Thompson decided to revisit the Winters residence alone, hoping the quiet house would reveal something overlooked initially. Entering the bedroom again, he observed everything carefully. The neatness now seemed forced, the perfection unsettling. Then he noticed something odd, fingerprints distinctly belonging to Gregory Dennis on the container of antifreeze, despite his claim he had never touched it. That night, Thompson lay awake, haunted by a question. Could Gregory Dennis, a respected psychologist, be capable of poisoning his own wife in cold blood? Days later, the detective obtained a warrant to review Gregory's financial records. What emerged was chilling. Gregory had withdrawn $180,000 from Susan's accounts immediately after her death and filed swiftly for her life insurance, $1 million. Debt collectors had been knocking at Gregory's door, a fact he'd successfully hidden from everyone, including Susan. It was enough for Thompson to bring Gregory Dennis back in for questioning. In a cold, sterile interrogation room, under harsh fluorescent lights, Gregory calmly repeated his story. "I love Susan. She was depressed. It was tragic. I didn't kill my wife." Yet despite his composed exterior, Thompson noticed something subtle. Gregory avoided eye contact when asked about financial issues and shifted uncomfortably when confronted with evidence from his digital footprint. He didn't crack, not yet, but the mask was beginning to slip. Detective Thompson knew that a single slip wasn't enough for an arrest. He needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed motive, opportunity, and concrete forensic proof to piece together exactly how and why Susan Winters had died. But for now, the detective had something more pressing to consider. A confidential source had just tipped him off. Gregory Dennis had a hidden life, one clouded by addiction, massive debts, and secrets dangerous enough to kill for. As Thompson stepped out of the interrogation room, he realized the case had become far darker than anyone imagined. It wasn't just a question of suicide versus murder. It was now a question of how deeply one man could bury the truth, and, more importantly, how long it would take before that truth clawed its way back to the surface. Detective Mark Thompson sat in his dimly lit office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the growing pile of evidence before him. The case had taken a sharp turn from a presumed suicide to something much darker, something that reeked of deception. He had seen his fair share of domestic tragedies, but this one was different. Every new piece of evidence pulled him further from the idea that Susan Winters had taken her own life, and closer to the chilling possibility that someone had wanted her gone. As he leafed through the latest forensic reports, a few things stood out. First, the levels of ethylene glycol in Susan's system were alarmingly high. According to medical experts, ingestion of such a substance in lethal quantities would not be an easy, peaceful passing. It would be agonizing. Severe vomiting, intense abdominal pain, and eventually organ failure. Yet the crime scene had none of that. The bed was undisturbed, the sheets were clean. There was no sign of distress or a struggle for survival. Then there was the matter of the search history, those ominous suicide-related searches. They had been found on Susan's laptop, yet further digital forensics uncovered inconsistencies in the timestamps. The searches were made late at night, while Susan was supposedly asleep. Even more disturbing was that some of the searches were conducted at times when Gregory Dennis was the only person awake in the house. The realization sent a chill down Thompson's spine. Was he looking at a meticulously crafted cover-up? The detective took a deep breath, trying to piece together the emerging pattern. There was also the money trail. The $180,000 Gregory had withdrawn almost immediately after Susan's death, as if he had been waiting for it. And the life insurance payout, a cool $1 million ready to be collected. Thompson had seen greed drive people to do unthinkable things before, but there was something unnerving about how swiftly Dennis had moved to secure his financial gain. He knew it wasn't enough for an arrest. Suspicion wasn't evidence. Gregory Dennis was a well-educated man, a psychologist, someone who understood human behavior well enough to manipulate it. If he had orchestrated Susan's death, he had done so with the kind of precision that made it difficult to prove. But Thompson also knew one thing. People like Dennis always made mistakes. His first step was to look deeper into Dennis's background. He sent a request for bank records, credit reports, and any hidden debts that Susan may not have known about. If financial strain was a motive, it would be buried in paperwork. Within a few days, what he received confirmed his growing suspicions. Gregory Dennis was drowning in debt. The psychologist had been living a double life. On the surface, he was a respectable, educated man running a successful practice. But behind the scenes, he had been losing thousands of dollars in gambling and spending exorbitant amounts on prescription painkillers, particularly oxycodone, the same drug found at the crime scene. He had borrowed money from multiple sources, and creditors had been closing in. His financial ruin had been inevitable. Unless, of course, something happened that could erase his debts overnight. Something like $1 million life insurance payout. Thompson's hands clenched around the file. It was beginning to fit together. The desperation, the financial ruin, the carefully staged crime scene. The detective had seen criminals attempt to mask murder as suicide before, but rarely with such cold calculation. Determined to keep building the case, Thompson sought to understand the last days of Susan Winters. He reached out to her close friends, colleagues, and family members. The common theme in every conversation? Susan had no plans to end her life. She was excited about the future, actively making plans for a vacation with her daughter. Her mother, Claire Winters, had been adamant from the start. Her daughter wouldn't have done this. Now Thompson was beginning to believe she was right. Then came the first major breakthrough. A forensic technician called Thompson late one evening with something crucial. Traces of ethylene glycol had been found in multiple areas around the house, not just in the cup on the nightstand. Residue was found in the kitchen sink, in the bathroom, and, most disturbingly, on a glass in the dishwasher, suggesting that someone had tried to clean up evidence after Susan ingested the poison. Thompson knew what that meant. If Susan had taken her own life, there would be no need for a cleanup. She wouldn't have attempted to remove evidence of her own actions. That meant someone else had been involved. The pieces were falling into place. As he prepared for his next move, Thompson revisited one final piece of evidence: Gregory Dennis's digital footprint. If there was one thing he had learned in years of detective work, it was that people always left digital trails, no matter how carefully they tried to cover their tracks. And then he found it. Among the deleted data retrieved from Gregory's devices, something stood out: a Google search made weeks before Susan's death. The search? Can you kill someone with antifreeze and make it look like suicide? A surge of adrenaline shot through Thompson's veins. This was it, the first tangible link between Gregory Dennis and the crime itself. The noose was tightening, and soon Gregory Dennis would realize that the lies he had built around himself were about to collapse. Detective Mark Thompson knew that unraveling the truth behind Susan Winters' death would be like pulling at a delicate thread. One wrong move, and everything could snap, leaving nothing but tangled knots of speculation and doubt. But the evidence, however circumstantial at first, was too compelling to ignore. The toxicology report, the suspicious financial transactions, and the manipulated digital history painted a picture far more complex than a simple suicide. Susan's parents had been adamant from the start. She wouldn't have done this to herself. And now the growing body of forensic evidence suggested they were right. This wasn't an act of desperation by a woman in emotional distress. It was something much darker. The first step in building a solid case was reconstructing Gregory Brent Dennis's timeline around the time of Susan's death. If there was one thing Thompson had learned over the years, it was that time always told the truth. Gregory claimed he had gone to bed early the night before and woke up the next morning to find Susan unresponsive. But digital data suggested otherwise. His phone records showed activity throughout the night, indicating that he had been awake and moving around. His car's GPS had registered movement in the early hours, contradicting his statement that he had been home the entire time. That alone wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to keep digging. The forensic team continued to analyze the scene, looking for anything that could point to foul play. That's when they found the first concrete sign of tampering. Traces of ethylene glycol, the same substance that had killed Susan, were found not just in her system, but also on a glass in the dishwasher, suggesting that someone had attempted to clean up the evidence. That discovery changed everything. If Susan had truly taken her own life, there would be no need for anyone to clean up. She wouldn't have tried to erase the traces of the poison that killed her. Someone else had been involved. Someone who needed to cover their tracks. Detective Thompson reviewed financial records that had come in from the bank. The withdrawals from Susan's account after her death had been immediate, a total of $180,000 pulled within days. Then there was the $1 million life insurance policy that Gregory had filed a claim for almost instantly. The urgency with which he sought financial gain from his wife's death did not sit well with investigators. It suggested forethought, planning, and most importantly, motive. Thompson wanted to know more about Gregory's life outside of his marriage. Friends and colleagues described him as intelligent and composed, but increasingly erratic in the months before Susan's death. Some of his patients had noticed missed appointments, erratic behavior, and unexplained absences. A closer look at his finances revealed massive gambling losses, along with large cash withdrawals linked to prescription painkillers. Gregory had debts, serious ones. He had been borrowing money, avoiding payments, and rapidly burning through cash. If Susan had discovered the extent of his financial ruin, it would have given him a reason to silence her. As the pieces started to form a clearer picture, Thompson pushed further into the digital trail. He needed something that would place Gregory directly at the center of Susan's death, not just through motive, but through action. That's when forensic analysts discovered a deleted Google search on Gregory's account, one that had been recovered from his hard drive. The search query was as damning as it was chilling. Can antifreeze poisoning be mistaken for a suicide? It was no longer a question of if Gregory Dennis had killed his wife. Now it was only a question of how soon he would realize the walls were closing in around him. Detective Mark Thompson sat at his desk, staring at the accumulating evidence that was now impossible to ignore. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, and what was forming in front of him was not the picture of a grieving husband, but that of a man who had meticulously planned the end of his wife's life. Each new discovery tightened the noose around Gregory Brent Dennis, exposing layers of deception that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The toxicology report had already confirmed that Susan Winters had ingested a lethal dose of antifreeze and oxycodone, but the timeline of when and how remained unclear. The forensic team had found traces of ethylene glycol on a second glass in the dishwasher, suggesting that someone had deliberately cleaned up after the poisoning. Digital evidence also showed deleted searches about antifreeze poisoning on Gregory's devices, proving that someone had researched the method long before Susan's death. But it was the financial motive that tied everything together. Susan Winters had been worth more to Gregory dead than alive. The investigation into Gregory's financial records uncovered a grim reality. He was drowning in debt, gambling losses, unpaid loans, and a lifestyle that far exceeded his actual income. The same man who had built a career around analyzing the human mind had allowed his own desperation and greed to drive him to the ultimate crime. Susan's $1 million life insurance policy had become his way out, a financial escape plan disguised as a tragic accident. And the moment she died, Gregory wasted no time. Less than 24 hours after her death, he had already started the process of claiming her insurance payout. It was cold, calculated, and disturbingly efficient. Detective Thompson knew that in order to secure an arrest, he needed more than just motive. He needed to prove opportunity and direct involvement. That meant placing Gregory at the center of the crime, showing that he had not only orchestrated the murder, but actively ensured that it looked like a suicide. The timeline of events leading up to Susan's death became the next major focus. The last known movements of Gregory Dennis painted a disturbing picture. In the weeks before Susan's death, Gregory had been making frequent cash withdrawals, amounts small enough to avoid suspicion, but collectively adding up to thousands of dollars. He had visited casinos, taken out additional loans, and was facing increasing pressure from debt collectors. It became clear that he was running out of time. On the night Susan was poisoned, Gregory's phone activity placed him awake and moving inside the house well past midnight, contradicting his claim that he had been asleep. Then, at 3:45 a.m., his car left the residence, stopping at a gas station, where he was caught on surveillance footage disposing of what appeared to be latex gloves in an empty antifreeze bottle. This was not the behavior of a man who had just lost his wife to suicide. This was someone erasing evidence. Even more damning was the fact that, according to financial records, Gregory had already spoken to an insurance agent before Susan's death certificate was even finalized. It was becoming clear that Susan's death had been a means to an end, a way for Gregory to escape his own self-inflicted financial ruin. But while Thompson was convinced Gregory was guilty, he needed a breakthrough, something irrefutable, something that would close every loophole and ensure that Gregory could not manipulate his way out of justice. That breakthrough came when investigators searched deeper into Susan's medical records. Susan had no prior history of substance abuse, no record of suicidal ideation, and had been planning a vacation with her daughter in the days leading up to her death. These were not the actions of someone contemplating ending their own life. More importantly, her prescription for oxycodone had never been filled. The only way it could have been in her system was if someone else had given it to her. Gregory Brent Dennis was the only person who had access to Susan's medications. The case against him was no longer built on speculation. It was solidified with forensic evidence, financial motives, and a timeline that placed him at the center of it all. Detective Thompson took a deep breath. The next step would be the most important one yet. Gregory Dennis had remained calm during questioning before, but Thompson had a feeling that the weight of irrefutable evidence was something even a skilled psychologist couldn't talk his way out of. It was time to bring him in. The weight of the evidence against Gregory Brent Dennis was no longer a question of if he had killed Susan Winters, but when and how law enforcement would move in to take him into custody. Detective Mark Thompson had seen suspects evade justice before, slipping through legal loopholes or manipulating the system to their advantage. But this time, there would be no escape. The case against Gregory was airtight. It had taken months of meticulous investigation, piecing together financial records, digital footprints, and forensic analysis. But now the walls were closing in. With an arrest warrant secured, Thompson and his team planned their approach carefully. Gregory had been aware of the investigation, but he had remained calm, confident, as if he believed his version of events would hold up under scrutiny. He had spent his entire career studying human behavior, but for all his expertise, he had underestimated one thing: the trail of his own mistakes. The morning of the arrest was deceptively quiet. Surveillance units had been monitoring Gregory's home for days, watching his movements, ensuring that he wouldn't suddenly disappear. He had no idea that within the next few hours his entire world would collapse. Just after sunrise, unmarked vehicles rolled into his neighborhood. The streets were still, the usual suburban peace undisturbed. Officers exited their cars with silent precision, moving toward the house with the calculated efficiency of a team that had done this 100 times before. When Thompson knocked on the door, there was a long pause before it opened. Gregory stood there, dressed casually, his face unreadable. The words were delivered with finality. "Gregory Brent Dennis, you are under arrest for the murder of Susan Winters." For a split second, something flickered in Gregory's expression. Surprise? Number. He had been expecting this. It was something else. A realization that his carefully constructed lies had crumbled, that the game was over. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, and as he was led to the waiting police car, the weight of the moment settled over the neighborhood. People watched from their windows, their quiet assumptions now confirmed. The respected psychologist, the husband who had played the grieving widower, was now being taken away in handcuffs, accused of killing his own wife. At the station, Gregory was placed in an interrogation room. The walls were bare, the air heavy with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. For hours he refused to speak, maintaining his right to remain silent. His confidence never wavered, but there was tension in the set of his jaw, in the way his fingers twitched against the cold metal table. What Gregory didn't realize was that outside that room, the evidence was speaking louder than he ever could. The prosecution was already assembling their case. Every financial transaction, every deleted search history, every surveillance frame showing his midnight disposal of evidence, it was all there, stacking up against him. There was no single piece of damning evidence. It was the accumulation of every carefully concealed detail, every tiny miscalculation that would seal his fate. The moment investigators had been waiting for came when a former associate of Gregory's came forward with an unexpected revelation. This individual, who had known Gregory professionally, revealed conversations where Gregory had spoken about ways to manipulate a situation to one's advantage. He had often theorized about how easy it was to make people believe what they were told, as long as the narrative was convincing enough. But his biggest mistake had been believing that the truth could be buried. Detective Thompson knew that Gregory wouldn't confess. Men like him rarely did. He had built his life on controlling the narrative, and even now, with the evidence closing in on him, he wasn't going to hand over an admission of guilt. But he didn't have to. The facts were overwhelming, and soon they would be presented in court for the world to see. As Gregory was officially booked and processed, the reality of his situation seemed to settle in. He wasn't going home. He wasn't collecting a life insurance payout. He wasn't walking free. Susan Winters had died believing she was trapped in a marriage that had become something dangerous. She had no idea that the man she had once loved was planning her demise. But now the truth was out, and the justice system was about to decide what that truth would cost Gregory Brent Dennis. The weight of the case against Gregory Brent Dennis had now shifted from the hands of investigators to the courtroom, where every piece of evidence, every witness, and every calculated move would determine whether justice would be served. The public was watching closely. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle, a case that had gripped the community with its mix of deception, greed, and betrayal. From the moment Gregory entered the courtroom, his demeanor was striking. Dressed in a carefully selected suit, he carried himself with the composure of a man who still believed he could outmaneuver the system. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't remorseful. If anything, there was an air of detachment, as if he was merely an observer in someone else's drama, rather than the man accused of taking his wife's life. The prosecution was well prepared. They didn't need theatrics. The evidence spoke for itself. The case was laid out methodically. The prosecution detailed the events leading up to Susan's death, the suspicious financial transactions, the digital manipulations, the forensic evidence proving that Susan's death had been staged to look like a suicide. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor painted a picture of a man whose financial desperation had driven him to commit the ultimate crime. Witness after witness took the stand. Medical experts confirmed that the combination of antifreeze and oxycodone was not a common method of self-harm, nor was it an easy way to go. If Susan had truly consumed the substance herself, there would have been signs. vomiting, seizures, agony. But there was none of that. Instead, she had been found lying peacefully in her bed. Forensic specialists explained how the search history on Susan's computer had been tampered with, how the deleted queries on antifreeze poisoning were suspiciously accessed when only Gregory was home. The jury was presented with security footage from the gas station, showing Gregory in the early hours of the morning, disposing of something in the trash. The recovered latex gloves, the empty bottle of antifreeze, the handwritten notes. They were all there, damning and undeniable. Then came the financial records. The prosecution displayed the timeline in a way that was impossible to ignore. Gregory was drowning in debt. He had gambled away thousands of dollars, had borrowed recklessly, and was on the verge of financial collapse. Susan's life insurance policy was worth $1 million. Less than 24 hours after Susan's death, Gregory began the process of claiming the insurance payout. It wasn't speculation, it was premeditation. When it was time for the defense to counter, their strategy was predictable. They painted Gregory as a grieving husband, someone who had made poor decisions but had not killed his wife. They suggested that Susan had been struggling with depression, that the tragedy was a result of her own actions, and that Gregory had simply been caught in unfortunate circumstances. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury wasn't just hearing about suspicious activity, they were seeing it in real time, through forensic science, digital records, and physical proof that Gregory had attempted to cover his tracks. The turning point came when Susan's family took the stand. Her mother, Claire Winters, delivered the most powerful testimony of the trial. She spoke about her daughter, about the woman Susan was before she met Gregory, about the joy, the ambition, the strength she had. She refuted the claims that Susan had been suicidal, describing the vacation Susan had planned, the future she had been excited for. And then she addressed Gregory directly. "You took my daughter from me," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "You thought you could get away with it, but you won't." For the first time since the trial had begun, Gregory looked shaken. The prosecution's final argument was simple. This is not a man who lost his wife to suicide. This is a man who saw her as a solution to his financial problems. He thought he could erase her life, stage her death, and walk away with a fortune. But he made one mistake. He left behind a trail, and today, that trail leads straight to justice. As the courtroom fell silent, all eyes turned to the jury. The decision would soon be in their hands. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The jury had been deliberating for hours, each second stretching into eternity for those waiting on the outside. For Susan Winters' family, this was more than just a legal proceeding. This was their final chance to see justice served, their last hope that the man who had taken their daughter's life would be held accountable. Gregory Brent Dennis sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Throughout the trial, he had remained composed, barely reacting as prosecutors dismantled his carefully constructed facade. But now, as he waited for the jury's decision, something in his posture had shifted. His fingers tapped restlessly against the table, his jaw clenched slightly. This was a man who had spent his life controlling narratives, manipulating emotions, bending reality to fit his needs. But today, he was no longer in control. The judge returned to the bench, calling the court to order. A hushed silence fell over the room as the jury filed in, their faces solemn, their decision already made. The foreperson stood, cleared his throat, and read the words that would determine the course of Gregory's future. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. For Susan's parents, there was a moment of raw, unfiltered grief, followed quickly by the weight of something that felt like closure. They had fought for this, refused to let their daughter's death be brushed aside as a suicide, and now, after years of pain and uncertainty, the truth had finally been acknowledged. But was this enough? Gregory remained still, absorbing the verdict. Manslaughter, not murder. It was a conviction, but it was not the full measure of justice that many had hoped for. The prosecutors had built a case for first-degree murder, for a calculated and premeditated act. Yet the jury had settled on something less severe. It meant that while they believed Gregory was responsible for Susan's death, they had not been convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he had planned it with the intent to kill. The sentencing came swiftly. 3 to 10 years in prison. For many in the courtroom, it was a bitter pill to swallow. A woman was dead. A man had carefully manipulated the circumstances around her death, lied, erased evidence, and still, he would one day walk free. Susan's mother, Claire Winters, stood quietly in the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched at her sides. She had promised herself she would remain composed, but as she listened to the judge's final words, a thought gnawed at her mind. Was this really justice? Gregory was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his fate sealed, but his sentence, a mere fraction of what the Winters family had hoped for, left an uneasy feeling in its wake. This wasn't the dramatic downfall of a man who had orchestrated his wife's death. It wasn't the kind of victory that left people satisfied. It was something far more complicated. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, microphones shoved into the faces of attorneys and family members. Susan's parents, though devastated by the light sentence, held their heads high. They had done what many families in their position had failed to do. They had forced the truth into the light, exposed the lies, and ensured that Gregory Dennis would never again be seen as an innocent man. But even as the cameras flashed and journalists scrambled to capture every detail, the question remained, did justice truly prevail? The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air. The decision had been made. Gregory Brent Dennis was guilty, yet the punishment felt inadequate. For Susan Winters' family, the moment should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like a compromise. 3 to 10 years. That was the price of a life. Claire Winters, Susan's mother, stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed to capture reactions. The cameras flashed, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a frenzy of coverage. To the world, the case was just another high-profile trial, another story to be discussed, dissected, and eventually forgotten. But for Claire, this was permanent. Her daughter was gone. No number of guilty verdicts could change that. Susan had been a fighter, a woman who had built a career in law, who had loved fiercely and had always been planning for the future. She had been taken too soon, and now the man responsible would serve only a fraction of the time he deserved. Gregory had manipulated his way through life, and somehow, even in conviction, he had managed to evade true justice. Inside the detention center, Gregory sat alone in his cell. He had spent his entire life analyzing human behavior, controlling perceptions, manipulating those around him. But here, there was no one left to manipulate. The walls of his own making had finally closed in. He had entered prison expecting to maintain his composure, to hold on to some semblance of control. But the reality of incarceration was far from the carefully curated life he had once lived. The psychologist had become the patient. The manipulator had become powerless. In the weeks following the trial, the media continued to dissect the case. Public outrage grew louder as people questioned how a premeditated crime could result in such a lenient sentence. Legal analysts debated whether the jury had been too lenient, whether the defense had effectively confused the narrative, whether the justice system had once again failed a victim. Susan's family refused to let the story fade. They worked tirelessly to bring awareness to cases of staged suicides, pushing for changes in how these deaths were investigated. Susan's name became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the fight for better protections against crimes masked as something else. Years passed. Gregory Brent Dennis served his time. When the day of his release finally arrived, there were no crowds, no reporters waiting to capture his first steps as a free man. He had become irrelevant, but for Susan's family, the loss remained. Time did not bring back what had been taken. Justice had been served, but it had been incomplete. As Claire Winters sat in her quiet home, she found herself revisiting old photos of Susan, letters, memories frozen in time. She had fought for the truth. She had won. And yet the cost of that victory was something she would carry forever. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.